much for that, Gaz, and for the introduction. I'm going to speak a little bit about my career as well, just to kick things off. But again, we're going to talk about alignment, culture of excellence, and what that means in various organizations, how we get to there, some of the considerations we may want to look at. So before we kick things off, I want you to think about this. And if you've seen some of my other presentations, I'm going to apologize for the story because it is from a while ago, but it's about a time that I did that I was on my way home and doing groceries. So think about when you were doing groceries the last time, and although things may be different today than they were a year ago, a couple of years ago, think about how you come together with the items that you're going to pick up, what your needs are, what you want to purchase because they're healthy, they're nutritious for you, it's good for you to eat, versus when you indulge and you may want to pick up some of the treats that you may sometimes want that are more just a desire as opposed to a need. So this story is from a number of years ago. My kids were quite a bit younger as well. They would have been about 6 to 3. Now I'm on the edge of having a teenager, but I picked up a number of groceries, some items on sale, brought it home, and a typical family tradition is to all participate in putting everything away in the fridge, pantry, wherever it may be. As we're going through the items, my younger son holds up a piece of broccoli and says, "Yuck, I don't like broccoli." So I explained to him the importance of eating nutritiously, how it is good for you. And maybe it's not it doesn't taste great to you right now, but you'll learn to enjoy it. If there's ways to season it, prepare it, you can make it something great. Keep going through some items. My wife points out that I picked up some yogurt, and we had ample yogurt in the fridge, but I saw it on sale. That was one of the items. I thought, hey, that's a great deal, I'm going to pick that up. But it wasn't something that we needed, and now we had excess. So had to come up with a plan of how we were going to deal with that excess as well. Get everything put away, and I see my youngest son crying. He's sitting on the floor. He's about 3 years old, and trying to figure out what's going on. I pick him up, I console him, ask him, "What's going on, buddy?" So he tells me there's no ice cream. And it's a little humorous, but at the same time, you need to understand his perspective, and had to explain to him that it wasn't something that we had planned on, and maybe we could put on the list for next week. And it's also not something that's necessarily that we need, especially since in this scenario, we were in the middle of winter. So needless to say, he understood, but being the great dad that I am, I caved and I got him ice cream the next day. But thinking about all of that, there's various needs, there's various constraints as well, whether it may be a financial constraint, depending on what your scenario may be, or it may be just the desires. Maybe there could be dietary restrictions, depending on those. So now imagine if we could all be aligned as one team. Right, we're considering the needs of everyone within that team. There are various stakeholders. Like I said, it could be different dietary needs within a family unit. And taking that, we focus on what's important, which is the health of everyone there. But we also want to focus on value, making sure that we're getting the best for our families. And we also want to effectively tell our stories. So when I put together a list, or my wife and I put together a list, how do we effectively tell the story of what it is that we're gathering for the family as we're going on that mission or that journey? And this is very reflective of what we see in our organizations in business. So going back to this scenario, like I said, things have changed. We've had to make decisions outside of just the grocery list. There's environmental factors such as the great toilet paper shortage that we had last year. And the thoughts of whether we wait in lines or whether we go do grocery pickup or just have our groceries delivered. So a little bit about my journey. I started my career in mining, surface mining, but I've had a lot of experience in infrastructure, asset intensive organizations. Spent most of my career in water and wastewater. and I moved over to facilities management. So I did a little bit of work for the city of Mississauga, and as Gaz introduced me, I'm now with the Simcoe Muskoka Catholic District School Board, where I lead the facility services team. So that's for maintenance and capital planning for the school board. There's 50 schools, 2 school board office administration locations. 24/7 operation, given that there are circumstances where we need to respond to any incidents that happen overnight. So portfolio includes not only the infrastructure management, but also infrastructure protection through security systems as well. So jumping into some more of the meat and potatoes here. So alignment. When we think about alignment, we think about how we execute our work. We think about the things that we do, and we want to make sure that we're doing things right. Many organizations may have these mantras. We do things right. We have controlled decisions. It's very calculated. We're a stable and predictable organization. Our teams are efficient, and we are well aligned for the success of the company. But I believe there's a few nuances that we need to consider as part of alignment. And when we think about that, we think more about how culture influences those specific sayings. So rather than doing things right, we are doing the right thing. Controlled decisions, we want to empower decision makers. So what information do they need, or what are some of the mechanisms that are in place to empower decision makers? And decision makers are not just the C-suite; they happen throughout the organization. There's decisions everywhere. We want to be stable and predictable, but we don't want to be boxed in by policy and procedure in such a way that it doesn't allow us to be agile and deal with exceptions. And that's, again, culture. Our teams are efficient, but we also want to make sure our teams are collaborative. There is some art involved in the work that we do. There's tacit knowledge that needs to be considered, and bringing all of that together, we're working not only for the success of the company, but also for our customers. Right? When we have customers, we are very focused on our purpose to serve. At the school board, our purpose is to serve our customers, who are our students, who are our teachers in the schools, the employees, everyone who uses these facilities, as well as community stakeholders and partners that we have, boards of trustees. So there's elected officials in municipalities, be your board of directors for your organization. In the context of this presentation, we're going to look at asset-intensive organizations, right? And we all operate those types of infrastructure. And we need to maintain them because they're critical to the services we provide, whether it's a building, whether it's a water plant, wastewater plant, mining plant, whether it's a fleet of vehicles. They all derive value, right? If we're going back to the ISO 55000 definition of asset management, we're focusing on the value derivation from our assets. So we ask ourselves 2 questions. So what's our purpose for the company, and who is our customer? And purpose isn't always revenue. Purpose is triple bottom line results. So we're looking at not just the financial impacts, but also socioeconomic and environmental impacts of our decisions, of our impact for not just the company, but beyond, and in the context of our customer. Without a customer, we don't have a business, because no one's going to be buying our product, no one's going to be buying our service, no one's going to be funding our services. So we really need to look at what are the services we provide to our customer. So I talked about the school board. We have our customers, and predominantly we're service delivery. Our services are delivered through the infrastructure that our customers occupy. Right? We need to make sure that there are spaces available to deliver programs in education, whichever courses, could be gym, could be hospitality. There needs to be places to eat. There needs to be places for lectures, or for gathering, whether it's being in assemblies, transiting through the hallways. So like any other organization, so when I walked into the Simcoe Muskoka Catholic School Board, there weren't too many well-defined processes. The services were there, There was a lot of practical application, but not much in the way of documentation. And when we asked ourselves these three questions, where does our organization sit in the industry? Where does our department sit within our customers? And what services do we provide to them? There wasn't a lot of clarity. And what I wanted to bridge was the work that our teams do, everyone in our team, and how does that work relate to the goals and objectives of the organization? How does it have an impact to our customers, our stakeholders, and in the end, really drive the purpose of everyone, every individual within the organization, and their contribution. So, like any great public sector organization, we did a workshop. We defined our team, so facility services there in the center, in the context of our technical services. So our services are on the left-hand side. So we have technical services, leadership, communication, reporting, public image, community support. Those are a high-level grouping of the services that this team offers. On the right side, we have our stakeholders, both internal and external. I talked a little bit about that. But through our exercise, what we did was we mapped out every service that our team provides. And it looks, it's more aggregated from that high-level summary that I showed on the previous one. One was positioning within our environment. This one here is identifying what is it that we do? What are all of the areas that we provide service to? How do we support them? How do we organize this? And then how do we identify, or who do we identify as champions in each of these service areas? So we used a fun exercise of putting sticky notes all over the walls, mapping out where there is duplication, making sure semantics aren't an issue. We're all speaking the same language. We're calling things what they are. And it's very clear to understand who is a program owner or service area owner, who then escalates through certain areas for supervision or responsibility, and mapping these out to eventually, and I'll get to it, but eventually business processes and a RACI chart for roles, accountabilities. So we have a suite of services that we're delivering, and we also have to balance needs. We're balancing technical needs and risk. And our risks are not they're not fixed, because our funding can change, regulations change. Right now, we're seeing in Ontario particularly, and in other provinces, there is regulatory changes specifically with the requirements for ventilation inside facilities in the context of the pandemic. So there are various changes. We need to be able to balance that with the resources we have. How do we supplement our resources, whether through expansion, through third-party services? Where do we implement redesigns in order to alleviate capacity constraints as well? So there's a wealth of information that needs to be considered, and I'm going to bring this into the context for this talk. I'm going to bring it into the context of capital planning. But how do we get to the point where we start talking about prioritization? Well, we need information, and do we have all the information we need? I like this cartoon because I mean, clearly Kermit doesn't have all the information that he needs, and he's going to be surprised when he does find out. So sometimes you need to get the experts in. You need to get you need to leverage the knowledge of the people who are involved in certain processes. And there's no one person within an organization that knows everything that happens and understands all of the decision points and all of the information that needs to be considered. So you need to leverage those experts. And that's, again, why we went through that process of service mapping, workshopping, and involving those subject matter experts. Now, the data that we're collecting, is there a reason for it? And there are times where data has been collected for a long period of time, but may no longer be used, but there's still people collecting it. And so there's a need to take a step back and understand, again, the processes which underlie that data collection. What do we use that data for? getting a common ground of why we collect this data is because we need information for decision making. Are we collecting it so that we understand that our processes are being followed, that we're able to keep the people that need to be informed, and are we using it again to optimize value? So we have great intentions when we start, but sometimes things get a little out of hand, and maybe over time they evolve to a place where they shouldn't be there. It's not necessarily a good thing to put measures in place to monitor just people. I really believe in the approach of taking information to help people support decisions. It's leveraging information in that context. We're not looking at reprimanding folks. We're not looking at finding people who aren't following the rules. We work with exceptions, but we don't deal or we don't manage by exception. So sometimes there's a lack of trust. Sometimes, hey, we've always done things this way, and so that's what works. And there's no appetite for change. And other times it's difficult to have tough conversations. And I think these are things that we need to move forward by defining processes and identifying how we deal with exceptions. I talked about where decision making happens. It happens everywhere in the organization, and so that's why we really need to empower people at all levels of the organization to make the decisions that are within their authority, and know when to escalate when they need to. So we took those service maps, we mapped them into processes. The screen just shows some examples. We went through a number of different areas, and we're still going through the exercise of refining them. These aren't static either. Things change. We find things don't work as intended. We find things just don't work at all, or maybe they were documented incorrectly. But what we do is we have an annual review process. We look at, we review these, make sure they still make sense. If it makes sense, great. But there's typically a few minor adjustments, a few improvements as well. And these processes then allow us to identify where are the points that we're going to measure in our process, and why are we measuring them? What are the decisions that we're going to be making? And the ones that we're showing here, they're work management related, maintenance management related. So we're looking at planning and scheduling, compliance, and our effectiveness there, and just making sure that our processes are working and we're being able to set up our teams for success. Now the process I'm going to focus on, again, we're talking about which process maps to define. And so we've got a slew that we came up with. I'm going to, again, later in this presentation, I'm going to focus on capital planning through an example here. And in this scenario, the challenges that we have were gaps in alignment. So we have multiple stakeholders, varying needs of what's important. So when you have these seven different departments that operate the portfolio, this example is specifically from a municipality, but there's 7 different departments operating the portfolio. The information that we have isn't the greatest. It's not connected to processes. A lot of the information is not even used. And so again, we've got people collecting information and it's not providing value. And our basis for capital budget allocation is we don't have strong story to say why we're investing in certain areas. And so we need to come up with some creative ways or new solutions to how we are able to have a stronger, or to how we were going to strengthen our capital planning process, how we allocate our funds, and how we mitigate risk through that. So where do we want to be? We want to streamline the process. We want to ensure that the information is accurate, or we have the best information available to make decisions. May not always be accurate, but that's a goal. We want it to be accurate. We want to reduce the validation effort. So this is field validation. What we were experiencing is there were a number of high-level identified projects, but 100% of those projects needed to be validated in field. We need to go verify, are these truly required? And if they are, then what do we do next? How do we determine the budget that's required? And can it be deferred? Is it urgent? What's the timing on it? So reducing the validation effort was one key area. Sometimes we were looking at a year or 2 years of validation effort in order to be planning for the following year, or following few years, because we were that far behind from the point of project identification to execution. Having a strong basis for recommendation. Again, how do we allocate budget? Do we take care of certain things through a capital project? Again, we're talking about funding, or are there incentives that we can leverage that would help not defer, but help soften some of the costs on required replacements. Again, there's lots of information. There are great processes and things that are happening within our teams. How do we leverage that? So how do we combine this information that's happening through our maintenance work, and how do we integrate that with our capital planning process? When I talk about information that wasn't being used prior, there were work orders with failure identification. There was information on mean times between failure that wasn't being leveraged for capital planning, condition ratings, monitoring that was happening through the field, but wasn't being cross-related to annual assessments. So how do we leverage all of that? How do we bring it all together and provide that story, that compelling story, to our stakeholders, our decision makers? So our decision makers in this scenario are those 7 departments that I talked about earlier. So knowing that we have a big target that we're trying to get to the center of, we focused on our asset registry and structure. How do we roll up our information? The risk framework that helps guide where we want to focus our energy on validation, on assessment, and identify where we would eventually focus our funding, because we are trying to mitigate risk. We have an age-based model or forecast, and that's what we are going to apply. That's what we did apply. Sorry, I'm speaking in present tense, but this is stuff that did happen. So age-based model, we have an age-based model based on a couple of standards, BOMA, ASHRAE, and I'll get to that in another slide, but there are various sources for that information. We wanted to strengthen that. Is it up to date? Does it reflect truly where we are? And we have a baseline, but what's the reality in the operating and environmental context of some of these assets? Condition monitoring. How do we monitor condition? What information can we glean from there? What are the needs of these facilities? Is there growth in certain areas? Are programs not being applied in certain areas where we may have had a strong community that use the soccer field? There may be dwindling registrations for field bookings. Likewise with hockey arenas or whatnot, the demographics of the community could change. And again, I talked about incentives and funding, whether it's energy rebates or retrofits that are available, as well as other options that could be investigated through grants available for the infrastructure. So starting with the asset registry and the structure, picked a simple hierarchy of how we organize our portfolio. Again, to roll up not just the analytics of the information that's available for these assets, but also for how we then allocate the funding. So depending on which envelope or stream that we're allocating monies to, and then monitoring the impact of that. So we also want to look backwards after we've made an investment and know that we have demonstrated an improvement in reliability and an improvement in service delivery. So that goes to our technical levels of service, defining what our assets do, defining what are the requirements that from each of the assets in each of the spaces. So an example here, where we need to continue providing service to our customers. A couple of examples, particularly with HVAC or ventilation systems. So we need to ensure that indoor air quality and comfort that meets the expectations of the occupants. We make sure that we have quality of service. So the finishes, these are again things that folks are seeing. The paint, the deterioration of the walls, floors. As long as when we're talking about quality, we're talking about not necessarily a functional requirement, but as a perceived requirement. And then legislative requirements, meet or exceed. I know I have meet, but we in many cases want to do better than the minimum requirements. So I know I've got an example here for a classroom, but this in context applies to also well, any indoor setting of a facility. So in this case, classroom floor, wall, ceilings that need to be clean and dry. We have ample lighting. Locks need to be able to secure the room when needed. Need to be able to supply the appropriate air exchanges for that space, and we have a comfortable temperature. So when we define these, we're able to then bring them into the context of risk. So when we lose those, what are the impacts when we lose those, and what's the probability of that happening? So going back to this municipal example, we looked at various consequences, likelihoods, and we also determined from that the distribution of these distribution of our portfolio based on their criticality, on those consequences and the likelihood of failure. So taking that risk information, we then use baselines for the conditions. So we have the probability of failure, then we have conditions that are going to tell us whether these are in poor or great condition, and we would then prioritize or rank all of those potential projects based on that. So FCI, popular in facility management. It's a percentage of your asset replacement cost. It's the requirements as a percentage, but it's based on a theoretical value of those replacements based on their age and that they're due to be replaced. And then we also overlay that with corrective work density. So we're looking at corrective work orders, unplanned work orders, and where we have 20% or more, we're going to take a closer look at that and see if there's overlap with FCI. I talked about age-based models and what you can use as a baseline. So BOMA ASHRAE, it's a starting point, but you want to bring that into the context of the specific installation. So the environment and the operating context. Condition monitoring, various mediums of how we get that done, supplementing in-house with external assessors, having them completed on a routine schedule. And sometimes they get completed because we've purchased or we're getting ready to sell or we've repurposed a space. So that information may be more readily available. So looking at those reports and bringing those into the context of the existing conditions for facilities. So we identify scope. They come from various sources, whether it's from our customer, whether it's identified through our systems. Link what's a duplicate or where there's an overlay. Look at desktop validation of those requests and take those over to understanding what needs to happen out in the field. So in this example, there's 368 potential projects. There's no way that we're going to be completing all of those. But we need to understand that that's based on the age of the infrastructure and a little bit of supporting information. We know that not all older assets are less. We know that older assets are not necessarily less reliable. But what we want to do is we want to understand what is the true reliability. We know that in many cases it's a random case of deterioration. It could be due to lack of maintenance or not following the right maintenance given the operating context or the environmental context. So we want to overlay all that data. We have modeled information. We have our database for the project costing. That's what we were using RS means. And then we have historical costs. So we're trying to budget because our risk is relatively high when we don't budget appropriately. If we're over the expected budget, then that project could get deferred another year until we have the appropriate budget set aside for it. So we could defer that. We expose ourselves to more risk for potential poor reliability. Take all of those projects and we then identify prioritization categories. So our stakeholders identified categories, and we went through a weighting exercise to weight each of the projects against these various categories, and we had to put one in there for internal customer ranking. Just it allows everyone to then have that personal prioritization to indicate what is most important to them as well. So various things you can do. You can, it's Kepler-Trago decision modeling, weight each of the categories and prioritize all the projects. This is the sensitivity that we did end up with after that ranking activity. And then it gets applied to all of the validated projects that were required to be completed. So there is a need, as well as now we have a ranking. So we know we can draw a line based on the funding constraint. But this is a starting point. We can now talk about what needs to, what does go ahead, what may need to be deferred, or how we then look at alternatives to accomplishing those projects. So in the end, 63 recommendations that came out of that exercise for the next planning period, and with the rest being deferred or not required or funded alternatively. We know data ain't perfect. Sometimes it's not even there. And so one of the things you want to look at is also the level of confidence, and depending on the gaps that may exist, there's ways to evaluate your various areas of data. So you can say that you have a certain level of confidence in the recommendations that are being presented for budget approval. And that's using the best information that we have. Right? We have to assume the things that we aren't able to measure, but we know the processes are in place, that we are doing what we're supposed to be doing in order to get that information. Various different, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I'm running near the end of the clock here, but visualizing our results, there's different ways to look at it. You can overlay, there's 5 different dimensions on this diagram, but it shows you the impact of investment based at, if you invest a certain dollar amount, what's the impact to the condition of the facility? And then you want to look at different options. There are various methods you can use, but you want to look at, again, what's the impact to those risks that you have. So when we want to boil it all together, when aligned results from a culture of excellence, it's knowing the difference between management change and change management. We talked about a lot of process change, but change management is involving the people. It's making sure that you have buy-in on the processes, make sure that everyone's engaged and that they support all the decision making that's going to be occurring, and that does occur. Bringing everyone along on the journey. Delegating process ownership, making sure there's line of sight, not just approaching it as a top-down approach, but understanding how your work influences the results of the organization, influences the results of the process, and how we execute as an organization. And in the end, it's making the right decisions for the organization and for the organization's purpose, as well as your personal purpose. With that, I know I rushed through the end there a bit, but I want to thank everyone, and I'm open for questions. Or I can hand it over to Gaz.
Thanks, Nigel. If you have any questions, just again, pop up that Q&A little chat box at the bottom of your screen there on FeedLoop, and you can ask Nigel any questions that you may have, or comments as well. I guess, Nigel, do you have any questions? I know you mentioned that you've done this presentation before, well, at that beginning part. Any questions that you usually have?
I have had folks ask me about software. That's a typical question. What do we use to manage certain data sets and then also bring it together? So honestly, there's different organizations are different, and sometimes you may need, you may have a database for your work management or work execution. You'll have a different application for capital planning. Here at the school board, we use a program called eBase for our work management or maintenance management, and we use VFA for capital planning. VFA is quite popular actually in the facility management world. However, there are other tools, there are other applications that are fantastic. You can, and bringing information together, you could even do that through Excel. I've used Excel to marry data into a database myself. And to query that. So it depends on what your comfort is with Excel as well. But various tools, like I said, the ones that we use at the board are that. When I was at the city of Mississauga, we were also using VFA, and in that particular example, we were using Infor EAM as part of our work management system. And in addition to VFA, we were also using CityWorks, which was part of our capital planning.
Thanks, Nigel. It seems that either people need coffee or that your presentation was quite robust and answered all the questions that they may have had. I don't have any other questions for you at the moment. Any other questions or any other final thoughts on your presentation since you have a few minutes left?
Well, another thought that typically comes up, and I've had this question before as well, is how do you give ownership of process to folks in the organization? And particularly, it's important it's important, but it's not quite visible or quite understood at frontline levels. So you may have frontline technicians or frontline service providers, reception areas, and how do they have ownership of processes? And part of that is that they are involved in defining how these processes are put together. They're the folks that are doing the work, and they're key members of developing the processes because they understand the ins and outs of how that work is done. The other part of it is it provides a lot more context. Now we're talking about line of sight. It provides a lot more context to senior leaders about the work that's happening on the front lines. It allows for reporting and information to go up the chain, as well as it allows the context of the organization to be brought to those front lines and understand when certain things need to be escalated. So defining the process and involvement in that is one. The other is knowing that there are many decisions that are within the authority, within that individual's role, within each individual's role, and that they have the ability to make decisions with the information that they're provided, with the training that the organization's given them, with processes that have been defined. And it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to understand that there are exceptions. And again, that if I can't emphasize it more, I truly believe it's the culture of the organization it allows people to function effectively without that stress. And when there's uncertainty, knowing that they can escalate to the folks that they need to in order to get the support they need.
Awesome. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to thank you, Nigel, for coming today and doing your presentation. As I mentioned before, this presentation will be recorded and saved on our FeedLoop website for you to enjoy until the 30th of November. Thanks, everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Thanks, Nigel.
All right. Thank you, everyone.